Welcome back to BLOCKTV. It's time now for Long Read Sunday. And crypto Twitter serves as a never-ending stream of information, thoughts, and discussions about the world of cryptocurrency. It's a mammoth task keeping track of it all, but fortunately we are joined every week by Nathaniel Whittemore, who lives and breathes the ecosystem and combines all the best of the best into his Long Read Sunday column. Nathaniel, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so kicking us off this week in your themes of the week, your number 5, as you see, is the most significant theme of the major crypto week so far, that's impacting arguably every market out there at the moment, the coronavirus. Nathaniel, what is your take on how this is impacting the crypto space and beyond?
Yeah, so it feels to me like, as you said, coronavirus is impacting everything. And I think on a actual structural level, we haven't really yet seen the impacts that are almost inevitable, right? And this is both in terms of the larger economic scenario as well as in terms of crypto markets, right? There's starting to see reports of mining being temporarily paused because of quarantines and things like that, but we really haven't had that discussion yet. The discussion we have had that I think is really interesting is this idea that we've hit a fundamental turning point, it feels like to me, in terms of our skepticism as it relates to authority. And what I mean by that is that obviously there is huge general base level skepticism of the numbers of infected coming, particularly out of China, right? There's a sense that those numbers just can't be trusted because there's too much incentive to minimize things, right? And they also seem to not really jive with some of the behaviors that are happening in terms of quarantine. So you have a mistrust on the one hand of an official government line, which of course isn't new. That's happened throughout history. What's interesting is that in this technology era and in this internet world, we are also, for the first time, I think, being base level skeptical of the leaked viral videos, right? These images coming out of China. We're not just accepting that the official line is wrong, but all of these videos coming out of China must be right. We're also skeptical of those videos, right? People are asking what their actual provenance was. Is there any chance they were something else? Is there any chance they were faked or doctored? So basically, people are skeptical of everything. And this isn't necessarily a nice thing reflecting in the times that we live in, but it is interesting to me that this idea of not being willing to trust without being able to verify is coming to roost or coming home to roost in this very important geopolitical issue.
Certainly, that issue around trust, that issue around the control of information, the dissemination of information, does seem critical. And yet, as much as there is distrust, even as you pointed out in your thread, there are those that have become symbols of trust, of truth, of dissemination, namely the Dr. Li Wen Liang, who discovered and originally tried to disseminate the information around the coronavirus and unfortunately died at just the age of 34, felled by the coronavirus itself. What do you think his story says about this notion of truth and dissemination of ideas?
Well, I think that big societal shifts tend to, unfortunately, often require martyrs. And he has become the martyr for basically Chinese control of information. And you've seen since his death a huge outpouring on Chinese social networks of calls for free speech and remember. And the censors have been working overtime to try to shut it down as well, but some of it's creeping through. And you're seeing op-eds pop up in papers all over the world around just how this is a challenge for the authoritarian government there. So I think that we're watching history being made, and it's happening in real time.
It does certainly appear as if history is in the making at this point right now, and perhaps, particularly in the case of coronavirus, will not disappear anytime in the near future. But let's turn now to other elements of history that are forming, shifting, and changing. Moving over to your number 4 theme for this week, that of project funding and M&A. A big kickoff as we start off 2020. There's been a huge amount, as you tweeted out just there. You can see the full list of some of the incredible developments that have taken place in just the last couple of weeks. Nathaniel, is this a bullish sign for digital assets and blockchain technology as a whole?
I think it is a bullish sign. I think that it's it's hard not to read it as bullish when you're seeing multiple projects being able to actually raise capital in meaningful ways and from interesting actors, right? So Securitize, that was notable. This is a round that they announced last year, but they've added Sony to it. Lightning has raised 10 million, which is obviously a very Lightning Labs, that is, which is a meaningful size raise. So I think that there's the things going on here is that there's clearly interest from venture capital in this space. You're also seeing this M&A activity, which has potentially interesting implications as well. So Bakkt in particular, they bought a company called Bridge2, which is going to help with loyalty solutions, which gets back to what they've reported as their ambitions for their consumer app, which should go beyond just cryptocurrencies themselves to a full range of digital assets, digital loyalty points, NFTs, et cetera. And that acquisition is part and parcel of that. So you're seeing all this activity, and I think that there's an interesting sub-story as well, though, because you're not necessarily seeing this same sort of activity in token sales, at least at the moment, right? This is the illiquid venture capital side of crypto funding, not the liquid hedge fund side of crypto funding, and that question of what the balance of liquid capital versus illiquid capital has been an interesting one. A few weeks ago, we had two separate venture capitalists. This was in January. One reported that they were seeing a huge amount of capital about to flow into this space, hundreds of millions, if not billions, and another reporting that they were seeing hedge funds shutting down left and right. And the reality is that these aren't actually as mutually exclusive as they seem at first glance. It has to do with which type of capital. And right now, we have a more traditional type of risk capital that is long-term, focused on equity, as you can see from these funding rounds.
So then to sort of summarize, would you say that this is a maturing, a streamlining of a market that is still in many ways, if not in its infancy, certainly still in its early days?
I don't know that I would call this a maturing, actually, because there's a mature version potentially of that illiquid capital as well. I certainly think that it shows that the people who are still around and want to take risk want to do so in a more traditional way than perhaps they did a couple years ago. But probably what it more means is that there's just not a real liquid return profile for token investing at the moment. Now, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have a cooling of capital markets around some of these tokens for a short period. We're still only a couple years out of the ICO boom, but it's hard to say. Basically, it's hard to label this traditional style of venture capital more mature versus more known. I think, in fact, there's probably a pretty good argument that the fact that so much of the energy has shifted to this illiquid traditional venture capital is a little bit reflects a failure of the token style liquid capital to actually get its stuff together and be a viable and not legally suspect way to invest.
Certainly a goal we can hope for all of the blockchain digital asset industry. Legality, regulation, always a positive element for a growing industry. But in terms of, I guess, non-traditional capital markets and non-traditional financial developments, we've seen an interesting one in your theme 3 for this week, which is that DeFi, the amount locked up in DeFi, has hit the $1 billion mark, a pretty significant milestone for an industry that is, by its definition, still in its infancy.
Yeah, we had two big psychological barriers that were pressed through this last week. One is obviously 10K that happened over the weekend. I actually didn't feature it as one of the themes. I had it up at the beginning, but it's sort of like important background noise. But DeFi seeing more than $1 billion locked up. This is even people in DeFi don't necessarily love this metric of how much is locked up in DeFi as the fundamental metric, but it does at least provide an ability to understand how the space has grown over time. And it basically took 878 days for DeFi to go from 1 million locked up to 1 billion locked up, which is a pretty rapid ascent if you think about it. And so I think that the important thing about this is that in many ways, right now, the crypto industry is Bitcoin and everything surrounding Bitcoin. It's DeFi and it's a whole bunch of other stuff that's trying to kind of burst through and be real. And I think that this sort of psychological moment of hitting that B level, that $1 billion locked up, has impact in terms of how serious different types of actors, not just the immediate early adopters, will take the space. And I think that's what's important about these sort of moments, like a billion in DeFi, like 10,000 in Bitcoin. It's not so much that on their own they mean all that much. It's more how they create context for new people to come into that particular investment space and that particular operating space.
Certainly that chance to grow a bit of legitimacy in the wider market, show your chops, show you're a little more serious, and maybe entice that next threshold, that next group of people into the market. But speaking of building legitimacy into sort of crypto and digital assets spaces, your theme number 2 for this week is one which seems to suggest there is that credibility building. We're talking about the Fed getting involved in the CBDC and crypto game, as you've called it, the game of coins. Nathaniel, what's your take on the latest moves that are happening from the Fed?
So we've obviously been tracking the central bank digital currency activity. It's continued to grow. It was Davos. It was all over Davos this year at the World Economic Forum. And the interesting moment last week is that one of the Fed governors, Lael Brainerd, gave a speech at Stanford where she said that the Fed was actively researching central bank digital currencies. And this is a little bit of a shift in tone from what we've seen previously. Previously, the Fed had been mostly dismissive of this. And there are reasons for that, right? It's a fundamentally different position to be in to have the current reserve currency of the world, which includes, by the way, a cash system, which is still very robust and in demand. And think about a digital currency than it is to be a contender for that, or just a smaller nation who, has their currency kind of subject to the whims of the market of currencies around the world. So the tone isn't so much that the Fed has gone fully bullish, but they are acknowledging that they have to be looking at this. They have to be researching it. And notably, it gives us a little bit of insight into how they see different parts of the crypto markets, right? So there's one paragraph in this speech about Bitcoin. It's the same dismissive line as before, which is that it hasn't really done much as a medium of exchange, which, by the way, I think continues to be good for Bitcoin to continue to not fly under the radar, I guess, a little bit when it comes to real intense focus from the Fed. When it comes to stable coins, they said that they're sort of interesting, but even that, it's very complex what a stable coin is. But Libra with its 1/3 of the world as users made everyone stand up and take notice and really forces the issue. So they even set up the context that we've been talking about for months now. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the Fed has gone full gung-ho on the digital dollar, but they're at least acknowledging that this is something that they can't really ignore anymore. And that's a pretty meaningful shift.
Certainly is a meaningful shift, and I suppose I wanted to get a little speculative with you for a moment. If China's plans for their own CBDC do manage to go ahead in a decent time frame, let's say throughout at some point in 2020, based on their own sort of projections and what people have been speculating, do you think that's the sort of action that could actually lead the Fed to take a serious look and sort of push them to the next level when it comes to creating their own CBDC, or are they just determined to work on their own timescale?
I don't know. It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell how concerned. I think it almost has to do more with just how concerned they are in general with China than the specific timeline of China's digital currency, given that China has been very clear that they're doing this, right? You've got Japan over here screaming to the Fed that they need the Fed's help to ward off Chinese influence in the region because of a digital currency. So it's not like maybe it's the triggering of the thing actually being live, and maybe they don't think China's as far as they say they are, and that's why they're not concerned. But I think it's a more dismissive posture in general, and that probably has more to do with who's involved and how they see China in general than the specifics of this issue. At least that's what it feels like to me. So I don't know. Maybe we would see if China launched a CBDC tomorrow, the Fed kind of jump in even more aggressively. But the reality is that you're not going to see the impact of a central bank digital currency right away, right? It's effectively an economic, it's almost an economic imperial tool for China, right? They are looking to expand their economic influence by having countries, particularly countries that they do a lot of business with, use this digital currency, which has a whole bunch of other implications. That's not going to happen overnight, even once it gets released. So it seems to me that the central question as it relates to how much China scares the US is not even just the timescale of China's digital yuan, but how much the US fears China.
Certainly an important question to ask. But speaking of US regulatory agencies, we have other ones that are getting involved in latest developments, changes in regulations and policies. And this leads us to your theme number 1 for this week, which you've titled Safe Harbors for Token Projects. It's coming off the particular heels of crypto mum Hester Peirce, the SEC commissioner, coming out and suggesting an interesting new regulation for the crypto space. Nathaniel, can you break down what this would mean and what the policies being suggested by Hester Peirce are?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Rule 195 is the technical name for this. And what a safe harbor means is that for some period of time, projects are allowed effectively legal leniency as they do something new that could be in questionable legal territory, but the government wants more ability to actually watch. And so the idea here is that token projects would actually be able to create their tokens, distribute them, sell them, and not just to accredited investors, but more broadly, and have a 3-year grace period in which to do that before they achieve some set of milestones around sufficient decentralization, which is a term that's been bandied about by the SEC without necessarily a ton of clarity, but is being applied at least in the case of Bitcoin and Ethereum to some extent. So the goal here for Commissioner Peirce is to create a scenario where US-based projects can be experimenting and be innovative without having to leave the US for fear of future reprisal from the SEC, while also having some amount more control and insight. There's more disclosures, there's more active engagement for these projects that would be participating on the basis of this Rule 195. So this is obviously very welcome to people who are excited about the possible experiments with tokenization. Tokens had more theoretical roles to play than just fundraising, but were so good at fundraising that that's really what they did. This potentially opens a window for some different experiments. Now, I think the most interesting thing in some ways is how realistic this is, right? Commissioner Peirce has been talking about safe harbors for a while now, right? It's been a regular feature of speeches. And I actually interviewed Andy Bromberg, the CEO of CoinList, for my Breakdown podcast today. And I asked him this question. There's many people who don't think that this SEC in general is at all amenable to crypto, and that this is likely to be just another thing that kind of languishes. And his response was that he didn't think that Commissioner Peirce would have spent the time to actually do this full proposal if she thought there was no chance of it happening. So some optimism from someone who's been at the very center of this conversation for quite some time. So it's going to be interesting to watch. I think it could have a dramatic impact on how projects form, what they decide to do, and where they decide to house themselves.
Certainly an interesting development from that regulatory space there in the US, where there is so much to watch. Good to be keeping an eye on things there. Nathaniel Whittemore, I want to thank you so much for breaking down your key themes for your Long Read Sunday this week. For those at home, keep watching at blocktv.com for all the latest in news and information. I'm Asher Westrop Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.